Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Research Insights with Elite Mind Academy. These are weekly live conversations between normally myself, Valentina Wright, Head of Impact and Insights at Elite Mind Academy, and Evelina, Founder and CEO. But this week we are joined by our wonderful guest, Anna Zanides, who is a mindfulness teacher, writer, who a book is coming out later this year. Is that right? And we'll cover that in a moment, but also has a background in computer science. So we'll be exploring the topic of how to create kind working environments with a leaning to an attention to mindfulness and mindful working. So mindfulness and Buddhist principles of living can be used as a way to support personal development and growth as both personally and in the work environment. It's a tool to dig deeper, question our habits, look at our preconditioned beliefs, and to drive intentional behavior change. So the way we work and live in our modern environment can often be destructive to our health and well-being and our performance. But there are ways that we can try to mitigate against that using principles and practices of mindfulness. So I'll come to you, Anna, first, and maybe give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit more about your background and in mindfulness, but also computer science, and maybe how those two intersect a little.
Yeah, so thanks for inviting me along. I'll do my best to cover the topics as best as I can. Okay, so it's difficult really to kind of put your life in contrary to what a lot of people think. Life is a lot more complicated than we tend to think. So I've done many things in my life. So I see. So what could I say? Okay, well, I'm a teacher in background, but that was quite later in life anyway. So before that, I did many things as well. I have a degree in computer science. I taught in many schools across the country. I've also been an e-learning advisor for a good few years, so travelled the country trying to support schools to implement technology for the good of the kids and the teachers. What else have I done? And then I fell into mindfulness really after being made redundant and getting divorced and losing my home and stuff. So I kind of like went, oh, I need help. So that's how I found mindfulness. And really, I've gone between mindfulness and Buddhism because really my interest was Buddhism, but then I found Buddhism quite difficult. So I'd flip over to mindfulness. And in the end, I did both. So that's how I ended up there, really, for help, to help myself in a time when things were really quite difficult. And now I teach mindfulness. I live mindfully, really. It's more important that I live mindfully. I've worked with cancer patients, mostly people towards the end of their lives. That's been, quite an experience. I work in schools. Yeah, I think that's about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I think it's also really important to kind of recognize when those personal experiences of loss and grief can actually steer us towards developing practices that bring us health and give us tools to handle those kinds of difficult circumstances. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about, where you think there is, or where you feel, and from your experience, there's an overlap somewhat between mindfulness and computer science.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because when I was doing my degree all those years ago, we touched on, say, artificial intelligence. I didn't do a lot in that because that was quite a long time ago. So it was, at the beginning stages, but obviously it's quite a big topic at the moment. That's kind of where we're heading. I have to say I'm a little bit of a geek, so I like my AI, but we do need to consider the impact of that on us as a society. But the similarity, or I guess, is because computer science is based on how humans work. So algorithms are written according to how we think. So the computer is designed around how we work. The mind, long-term memory, short-term memory, all of that is designed around the human being. So understanding our mind, understanding how computers work, they're quite similar, they're quite aligned. And contrary to what a lot of people think, you might imagine people sitting behind a computer designing algorithms as being geeks or whatever it is, but actually they need to have quite good understanding of human behavior to be able to model that into a computer. So it's, I think, quite aligned, but obviously there's a lot of ethics that we need to be thinking about as computer scientists, and how that might affect society over the long term. So that's a whole big different topic.
Yeah, certainly. That is definitely a big topic, and one that's being talked about a lot at the moment. We're seeing AI and computer technologies integrated into more and more practices or services that we think of as intrinsically human. But no doubt we could talk for hours about that another day.
I think the important thing for me is to bring out a couple of things from that. One is that the more we become automated, or the more of our tasks that become automated, the less challenged we will be. So one of the concerns about AI is that if complicated and complex problems are solved by computers, then there'll be less need for us to do it. And the problem with that is that the less complex our mind needs to be, the less likely we are to actually sorry about that, hold on, have I lost you?
No, we can still hear you. Can you hear us? And
I'm here, sorry. So the less complex our mind is, the less we're challenged, the less we're accessing the subconscious mind. And it's the subconscious mind which has the knowledge stored in it, so that's I think that's going to be a huge problem.
Certainly. And I think that's really fascinating, the way that we can notice that link between our environments and the way that we are engaging with technology, and actually how that affects the way that we engage with our own minds and our own selves, our own consciousness, and becoming aware of those kinds of habitualized practices where, exactly like you say, when we are we learn to critique less, and we learn to take that that kind of observer or critical perspective less frequently, then it can become harder to do so. And one of the points that we did want to cover today, because looking at the working environment and how to create kinder working environments, is about when we do notice that something is wrong, or there's some kind of injustice in a work environment, how do we challenge that? Because as you rightly say, if we're not in the practice of challenging, we're not in the practice of critiquing, it can become harder. So I wonder if you have any tips or insights around that we can bear in mind, so that we can...
I think I was thinking about this before we came on, because there is a really big misconception in regards to things like mindfulness and even being a Buddhist, because we confuse kindness with this almost becoming a doormat. We talk a lot about this in Buddhism. It's not the idea that we become a doormat and we smile at everybody, and that's actually quite fake. And I think that's part of what I call spirit. It's almost like this kind of ego-driven spiritualism, and it's not real. Okay, so to be kind first is also about realizing if something is affecting you, and it's a negative, has a negative impact on you, the kind thing to do is to decide whether you want to be in that situation, or whether you want to be around that person. So kindness isn't about putting up with stuff. It's actually about going, no, the kind thing to do is for me to walk away, or the kind thing for me to do is have that conversation, because one, I need to protect myself, and two, the person that's doing it or the situation, they might not even be aware. And even if they're not, sometimes we have to hurt other people's feelings, and that's where we get confused about what we think kindness is. And I have a real issue with that in our society, with people that are out there saying they teach mindfulness, or they're, spiritual, or whatever it is they put across this image, which it's not correct, and it's actually quite harmful.
I think that's a really good point, because we can often forget, and when we think about kindness, we can synonymize that with kind of subjugating or relegating our own needs and prioritizing others' needs, or kindness towards others can mean that we are unkind to ourselves, or we sacrifice ourselves for others. And actually that overall can create more harm, because generally it's harmed people, or people who are hurting, that are more likely to hurt others. And when we practice that kindness and that compassion with ourselves, then we can start to see more easily in our relationships with others where we can fit that in with them, or where that kindness is truly kindness, and when it's something that's more in line with what you're saying about performing a spiritualism or a mindfulness, but actually not really engaging with what the dynamics are at play, and taking that more observational role.
I think I mean, as a parent, I would say you could put it in the context of, we think that it might be kind to always make sure our kids have everything, and we give them the easy way, and we make it easy. But actually, if we're really going to be kind and loving towards our kids, sometimes it's actually allowing them to fall. So the kindest thing that we can do to a child, say, for example, is to allow them to fall, so that they can grow up in the real world, not the world that we think that, they're going to live, but in the real world. And I think that goes in workplaces. A lot of what concerns me is the whole idea of, well-being is get someone in to give you a bit of a massage.
Yeah.
But it doesn't change it doesn't make a difference, really. It's all temporary. It's a temporary solution, or a temporary distraction from the much bigger picture.
Absolutely. And what I often think with this as well is that we are then training people, if we do kind of essentially approach difficult situations or discomfort with just simply soothing and without questioning, then we train people not to be able to handle those situations or think critically in those situations, and also not to retain the ability to self-critique and to think about how we have been influencing that dynamic, and thinking about work environments. So how would you say, if we were to notice an injustice in a work environment, so let's say that someone has been discriminated against in a work environment, what would you say, with this in mind, would be a useful way or a constructive way to challenge that, kind of bearing in mind these principles?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, if we're going to be really honest here. Okay, when you're in a situation, when you're in a workplace and you have to earn an income to feed yourself and house yourself and perhaps have a family, it's really unfair for us to think that the situation is straightforward. Because, say, for example, with me, I've created a life where I'm pretty free to how I live my life. But if I go back when my kids were young, I was in a very different situation. So when we say, what can we do? I think it really depends on how you are, what your life is, what situation you're in. If you're in a situation where you can speak up and you're not scared to put yourself in some kind of difficult situation where it might challenge your job, that's the problem, isn't it? I think the problem is many of us would speak up, but many of us fear our jobs. And if we're really going to be realistic, most employers don't necessarily allow the freedom for you to speak up. They might say they do, but it doesn't mean in the reality they do. So I think it's really difficult to go, you should always speak up, or you should not speak up. Either way, I think it's all to do with the personal situation that everybody is in.
I think that's a really, really good point, because you're right in that different people will have different challenges and risks in their lives at any one point, and that has to be considered. That it's reasonable to consider the risks of potentially losing your job, depending on, you might have dependents, you might be in more of a precarious financial situation, the context of the work environment, whether it's likely that challenge is going to be met constructively, and all of those factors. So I think you raise a really good point there. And I wonder, kind of, then perhaps there's the focus can start with ourselves and kind of how to develop that sort of self-awareness so that we can more easily make those decisions based on our weighing up our own needs and our own barriers or risks, and more clearly see the dynamics of the situation so that we can make those decisions. And do you have any advice or tips around how to develop that kind of self-awareness?
Yeah, I mean, my book is very much on all of that, because I think it's about being aware of what really matters to you and whether you're caught in the trap that a lot of us get caught into, which is, that I must have this great job and I must have this big house and I must have the more money. And, if we're caught in that trap, to have an awareness, to be able to walk away and really ask yourself these questions of, what am I doing in my life and why am I doing it? And is it really aligned with my real values and with what I really want in life? Or am I just going along with how I'm conditioned, how I think I should be because other people have told me that's how it should be? And one of the things that isn't talked about a lot in mindfulness is, and I think that it comes a little bit more from kind of the Buddhist perspective, is we tend to think that, if you're meditating, that you should be in some kind of blissful state. But actually, meditation can be quite the opposite. It can be, when I first started meditating properly, and I was going at that time through so much in my own life, I spent most of my time crying. I mean, I'm on the cushion just crying, because it was there that everything would come up. And so what we're not looking at is the reality of when you start to do meditation or reflection. A lot of the time it's reflection, and it's asking yourself questions and focusing on a question. And in Buddhism, that's what we call it. We do, retrospection. We sit and we think about a specific question, and we allow that question to be explored in our mind, not because we're going, I need to find an answer, but we kind of want the answer to rise. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's, I think, a really good point here, and worth highlighting again, is that this misconception that mindfulness and meditation is about being in a blissful state and being in a state of happiness and contentment all the time. And actually, that mindfulness is about being present in what you are experiencing and developing that awareness of what you're experiencing that may be very deep beneath the surface. And actually going there can be quite a difficult and emotionally raw experience. The more we do it, the more we engage in it, the less threatening those emotions are when they do come up, because we are practiced at how to handle them. It also can be that they're not so, after we've been practicing mindfulness and meditation for a while, there's less backlog, let's say, of the emotions that we might need to explore. We'll have a greater awareness of what we have been through and what will be familiar to us in terms of difficult emotions that are coming up and how to handle those. And as well, I think it's worth noting that, in that practice, and if someone is developing that kind of practice of meditation, you can take it step by step, and you can go as deep or as kind of surface level as you like, as you're feeling out what feels comfortable and developing that practice and that comfort with difficult emotions. You're starting with even just 30 seconds of silence and focusing on the breath, and developing that, maybe eventually into half an hour or an hour a day. And I wonder, for you, what was your experience with developing that practice of self-awareness and looking inwards?
Well, I mean, I think for everybody, it's always personal. And also, it's not a linear, oh, I'm improving, I'm on the next stage. It doesn't work that way. And I guess for me, it was different because I've explored Buddhism most of my life. So it kind of was different, I suppose. But I think what I find is that when I'm working with people, I think the people that are most willing or open are usually people that are really desperate for something in their lives. So that's why working with people living with cancer or loss or bereavement and things like that, I always found it aligned a lot more with me, because then I could dig deep with people. And I think what the difference, I guess, with how I do it and how I've been trained is because it comes from my own experience. So when I'm teaching somebody, I try to make sure we're not doing this from the intellectual, conceptual point of view. It's not about me saying, 1 and 1 makes 2, now, do that. This is about my experience and their experience and how we experience it differently. Mindfulness can't be taught as an intellectual thing. It's not an intellectual practice whatsoever. You can read a little bit about it, but unless you actually sit with it or walk with it or eat with it or whatever it is, because mindfulness isn't just sitting on a cushion. In fact, that's not always even the thing. So it's really about being present and always questioning yourself. It's questioning yourself. It's, that person annoyed me. Yeah. Why did that person annoy me? And then maybe coming back from it and thinking, okay, that person touched something. It's not about them. It's about me. And that's the power of it, really. It's always coming back to yourself. And that's why it's difficult for so many people, because we are taught in society that everything that's going to make us feel better is out there. The good job, the perfect partner, the bigger house, the whatever, that's going to make me feel better. But actually it doesn't. None of that does. So we're saying here in our kind of community or way of life is, forget all about that. You need to turn inwards. You need to look at yourself, because that's all you've got.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really interesting question to pose and a really interesting point to pose when we're thinking about how to construct our working environments to support our well-being. And there needs to be a recognition there that there's a dual responsibility here. There's the responsibility of the organization to create an environment that is conducive to a mindful, self-aware lifestyle and one that promotes well-being. But there's also a responsibility on the individual to do those practices, to engage in that kind of self-awareness, and to not be expecting their external circumstances to solve all of their problems or to be the thing that makes them feel joy or makes
Mm.
them feel contentment and presence in their lives. And when we are thinking about our working environments and actually our lifestyles, it can be difficult sometimes to know whether they are helping or hindering us. And we need to be able to know that so that we can make some changes where we can to our environments. But from your perspective, how can we tell? How can we know, or make a best guess at whether our lifestyles or our working environments are helping or hindering us in terms of our well-being?
I think we know. We
Hmm.
do know. We all know that something isn't good for us. There is a knowing in us that that we say, for example, I remember years ago when I was working, I had quite a high profile job and I was working in just off Good Street in London in a really posh kind of London building. And the environment was awful. I mean, my boss at the time, I don't want to name him because he's probably was quite well known. He was not a very nice person. And also the whole environment, just even though it was in education, it was just so toxic is all I can say. And I remember once going out. At that time I used to smoke, so I went out for a cigarette, and there was a group of homeless people in the park in the middle of the day, and they lined up the place. They had a big ghetto blaster music coming out, and they'd laid out all their muffins on the thing, and they looked so happy, and I'm sitting there with these posh clothes on and expensive shoes on and thinking, I actually went, I want to be you. And luckily I was made redundant and I had to change my life.
Mm,
So I think there are moments that come into our lives where we know, but we just, the fear of seeing it, the fear of acknowledging is big. Because if I
mm.
see that I don't want it this way, then I have to do something. So maybe it's just better that I just distract myself.
And I think that that's something that perpetuates a lot of toxic and harmful dynamic situations and environments, is this fear that we have, or this resistance to action and taking responsibility for something and making changes, because there are a lot of stresses and demands placed on us in our modern world, and that can give us a sense of fatigue, whereby we actually just want things to be straightforward and easy. And breaking out of our routines and our habits, so all of the things that allow us to go on autopilot, breaking out of those requires more energy and critical engagement and awareness of ourselves, and awareness of our emotional states and the things that are affecting us. And that can all be quite intimidating, because it can be difficult work and it can leave us feeling groundless, because we aren't rooted in the same habits of
Mhm.
going to the same workplace, let's say, every day, and knowing we're going to have the same paycheck and see the same people. And that's why we can often stay in harmful environments, because they're familiar, because we can at least go on that autopilot and kind of absolve ourselves of the responsibility of taking action and critique. um
Yeah.
but I think that you've really kind of well highlighted that sometimes we it can, those external things like being made redundant can really give us that push to, when that changes our environment for us, and maybe we haven't taken the initial step there to leave a toxic work environment, let's say, but it's happened, and actually those can be real gifts whereby it allows us to make that change. It kind of starts that process where we can begin looking at ourselves and actually what our needs are.
Yeah, I was going to say, because also what I think is really, really important here is that ultimately what we all want is freedom. And when we talk about freedom, it's not physical freedom necessarily. It's the freedom to be ourselves, and we think that we will get that freedom sometimes because through financial means or any of that. But what I've learned is that freedom is something we can give ourselves in an instant. It really is us going, I'm not buying into this anymore. And you can be in a job that isn't that bad, actually, for example, but we can make it into hell just from our thoughts, So it really is about seeing things as they really are, rather than, making up these kind of stories about how bad the job is, for example. That, we can really make things way worse in our heads because everybody else is. For example, you might be in an environment where there's a couple of people that are really, really negative all the time. Well, then you can either stick with it and go along with them, or make a conscious decision to say, I don't want to be around them. And that's how I live my life now. I just say it as it is. If I'm with people that are having a negative impact on me, then I tell them, and I just either say it's either changed or I walk away. I go into schools a lot. Schools they can be really negative places. And it's not the kids, it's the adults that are like that. And, I kind of just go in and say, I'm not taking notice of that. I'm not involved in that. I detach from that. I'm here to do this,
Developing that kind of ability to recognize and step back and say, hold on, am I just allowing myself to be taken by the current? Or am I, how can I participate in this in a way that doesn't perpetuate it, in a way that allows me to have that freedom, exactly as you say, and actually choosing how to participate rather than just be taken by it. And I suppose that awareness can come through practice, through practicing things like meditation, but also, exactly like you say, getting in the habit of just asking ourselves, questioning things, what's going on here? What is actually happening here? And getting more comfortable with being able to face those truths rather than feeling that that's going to destabilize us or threaten us in such a profound way that we can't look at them.
Yeah. And I think a couple of things that maybe we need to think about is when we start to change and when we start to see things from a different perspective, it does take courage. It takes a lot of courage, because what happens when you do that is that you then no longer can put up with certain things in life because you now see it from a different perspective. But that's why I say, once you've overcome those kind of fears and those thoughts in your mind of some kind of tragedy happening, if I do change, or if I do move away, or if I do address this, when you've overcome that, when you've worked through it, the freedom then comes automatically, because then I can walk away from this. I can change it. I don't have to put up with it. I can speak up, I can get another job, I can move, I can whatever, because all those options are for us, luckily, in the country that we live in, which has got a lot more freedom for us to do things than in so many other places in the world. So we're quite lucky to have that. And there's so many narratives in society that make us think that it isn't possible, or that we're in really bad place at the moment, and all of those. I think if I was to give anybody advice, is switch it off. Just switch all that noise off, stop listening to it. And you don't need to know what's happening everywhere in the world, actually, because what difference does it actually make to you or to them? And you don't need to allow all of that toxicity into your life. You don't need to listen to those conversations. You need to be paying a lot more attention to yourself, your life, and where you want it to go.
And because all of those things as well, engaging not just in, say, pleasures and other kind of distractions that make us feel good, but even engaging in those distractions like negative news stories that can make us feel bad, that is all taking us away from looking at ourselves and being present in ourselves. All of that is taking us out of ourselves, and a lot of that can be because we're not that comfortable being in ourselves, and we're looking for a sense of entertainment or distraction, and rather than that kind of inward exploration. But actually, all of those things are cognitively draining. Engaging in, knowing about everybody's lives, or focusing our attention on a lot of external events and circumstances, can be really quite draining, which means it's then harder when we do want to make a change or challenge something, to actually feel that we have the energy to do that. And I also think, with that in mind, there's, I kind of wanted to lead on to a little bit the subject matter of psychological safety, because it's something that we want to create in our workplaces, and I think is extremely important to create in our workplaces. There's a responsibility on organizations to create and support environments that allow us to feel psychologically safe. There's also responsibilities on the individual to protect and look after their own psychological safety through developing an ability to do that. And I will also just say, for anyone who's listening, please feel free to ask questions, use the chat to comment. Sorry, I should have emphasized that earlier on, but do feel free to ask questions if you have anything in your mind. But yeah, I just wanted to come in and hear your perspective on psychological safety, from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's a huge subject, but I think the most important thing is for us to understand that we can't really protect ourselves from everything. So, no employer is going to be able to create a fantastic, perfect environment. It's not going to happen. The world isn't like that. Being in a workplace is no different than being in life. We can't protect ourselves from all the negativity, all the bad things. The only thing we can do is know how to be okay when things are not okay. And that's the biggest thing, is learning to be okay when things are not okay. That's happiness, right? That's what real happiness is. Happiness isn't, some up there, fantastic joy thingy. That's temporary. Happiness is being okay when things are not okay. So it always will come back to you developing this inner strength, this inner self ability to be with yourself, that isn't easily disrupted by what happened at work today, what that person said to me. My boss doesn't like me as much as so-and-so. All of these things, they're lies in many ways, because this is just our interpretation. That's just us interpreting. And so the main thing that we can do to protect ourselves is to know we can't protect ourselves. Right?
Certainly. So to essentially take a level of responsibility there. So yes, there's responsibility on others to be kind and compassionate, create these environments, but there's also a responsibility on ourselves to know that we will encounter difficulties. There will be experiences, other people who will make us feel bad or will act in a way that has the potential to make us feel bad. And by practicing mindfulness and practicing that ability to take the role of observer within our own selves, we then have a choice, because there's a gap between that event or stimulus and the reaction or the response. And it's in that we have the control to choose how we're going to respond and choose how we're going to take that piece of information or that event, and what we may want to learn from it, about others, about the circumstance, about our own reaction to it, and how we can understand more about ourselves and develop those kinds of coping practices. And I think that's really useful to be aware of that, and can actually be really empowering as well, to know that we can have that choice. We can hold some of the control over our own psychological safety, rather than hoping and trying to convince everybody else to take responsibility for our psychological safety.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think the point of it is that if each of us took responsibility for ourselves and became the best person we can be, just imagine the world.
Mm.
If each of us did that, just imagine the world.
I think that's really, really important, because we often, when we're trying to tackle these issues of toxic workplaces and harmful environments, we focus very, very much on the big picture, which is important. We do need to focus on the big picture to some extent, but we can sometimes forget the power that we have to simply disrupt that dynamic by changing the way we participate in it, and by working on ourselves and developing strong relationships with ourselves, whereby we are more resilient and we're more able to be kind and compassionate, both to ourselves and to others. And just like you say, be the best version of ourselves that we can be. Then that is the kind of most direct way to contribute to a more positive and constructive environment, not just for us, but for everyone. And if we all, when in doubt, start with yourself. Yes, we want to have influence over and try and change dynamics and structures more widely. But when that all feels like maybe a bit too much, or actually even just running parallel to that always, we should be starting with ourselves, because that is what enables us to start affecting the change, rather than just thinking about the change and strategizing about the change.
Yeah, most definite. And I think it's important that, if we're in interactions with people, say that are come across as angry all the time, or nasty, bully, whatever it is, it might help for us to think their internal world can't be very good.
Mm,
And, that's where compassion comes in, because then we can say, wow, that must be a bad place for you to be in every single day, every minute of the day, because if that's what's in your internal world, you can't escape that. That's what you take with you everywhere.
mm,
So, I'm not saying that you should ever allow somebody to bully you or treat you badly. That's where you move away from it, you walk away from it, or you do something about it. But it does help when you see that behind that person's behavior is obviously some deep rooted issue,
mm.
problem, unhappiness, whatever.
Certainly, because and I think that's a really useful thing to focus on and just to highlight, is that in having compassion for others and having empathy, trying to understand that, even those that hurt us, are likely suffering, they are likely struggling. That doesn't mean that we allow that to happen. That doesn't mean that we continue to allow ourselves to be harmed by that person. We have the agency and the control to remove ourselves from that situation, or to detach ourselves. Even if we can't physically remove ourselves, we might be able to emotionally detach from what that person is.
Yeah, I mean, I had a great story that one of my teachers taught me years ago. And it was about the difference between compassion and empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, with empathy, you take the position of the other person almost. You feel their feelings, and empathy can be quite harmful to you when you feel that way. Whereas compassion is different, because it was like, if you're on a lifeboat and there's people drowning in the water, empathy is that you jump in the water, and in doing so you drown with them. And compassion is you stay on the boat and you reach in and you pull one person out at a time. That way you keep yourself safe and you've saved people. So compassion isn't about you jumping in and drowning with everybody. It's looking after yourself so that you're better able to be there for other people that need you. And if we put it into the workplace, if I'm drowning in everybody else's toxic environment and their conversations and their constant negativity, one, it's not improving anything there. Two, it's not helping me. And three, nothing's going to change. You're just going to keep it's like adding fuel to the fire. So the way to change it is to don't engage with it, and maybe even make it clear why you're not engaging with it.
Absolutely. And that, I think that's a really useful example to remember that difference between empathy and compassion, and that there are situations where empathy is appropriate and there are more other situations where compassion is more appropriate. And a lot of it is about finding that right distance from the emotion and from the experience. So being able to, like you say, reach out and kind of touch that person's experience. So understand it in enough so that we can, with your example, pull them out of the water. But even simply so that we can have an awareness of what might be going on for them, but not so much so that we take on what is going on for them, that we still remain connected to ourselves, that we always have at least one foot in ourselves, whereby we can ground with how we're feeling, and we retain that ability to stay in control and to stay well. Make constructive choices in those circumstances, because we want to be able to understand others. And I think the word empathy gets thrown around a lot as though it's simply just about understanding others. But you're very right to make that distinction, that when we actually use the word empathy, we're talking about feeling others' feelings as though they are our own. And that's a lot, that's a lot to bear, and that's a lot to take on, and we can't do it in every.
And I think that was interesting, because when I was working with cancer patients a lot and all that kind of thing, people would say to me, or how is it that does it affect you? And of course it does affect you, but then you also need to have a kind of boundary. You've got to be able to separate between the two. And actually I went to see my Buddhist teacher last week, because I was having a little bit of a struggle with somebody that I was a friend with, but then decided, because their impact on me was quite negative, I just kind of I just said, I don't want to be friends anymore, whatever it is. Sounds childish, but that's the idea. But her advice was really, I didn't think of it, and it was you can have friendships, you can have people you work with, but you got to be able to keep hold of yourself. There needs to be almost this kind of barrier around you. Now, people might think, oh, well, that's cold. but actually, it's not. It's the most loving thing you can do, actually, is to have this ability to know that we are not obliged to allow everybody into our own space. There needs to be that kind of protection around us in life, if we are to live, happily and healthily. And that's in all situations, whether it's your, even if it's your own children in some ways,
Certainly. And that's, we need to have that boundary and that space so that we can be our best selves and can contribute our best selves into the world. And that is exactly like you say, that is the kindest and most compassionate way to be. And we, simply because someone is asking something of us doesn't mean that we're doing something wrong by saying no. And simply because they are hurt doesn't mean that we have done something wrong by setting that boundary. And I think that can be quite a difficult lesson sometimes for some people, because we don't want to cause harm to others, and we see that harm often in the short term and in the immediate, without seeing the bigger picture of actually how over time perpetuating dynamics like this can be more harmful. I'm just aware of the time, so I just want to take a moment to kind of summarize some of the key learnings from this. And I think the things that have really stuck in my mind is that there's, by practicing a connection with yourself and through, everyday mindfulness, asking yourself, what's going on here, stepping back, taking a critical perspective, or through meditation practices. But by developing that self-awareness, then that's how we are more able to ascertain whether our habits or our environments are constructive or destructive. It will also help us make decisions around when to and how to challenge injustices, but also how to potentially remove ourselves or disrupt toxic dynamics by changing the way that we participate. And also to develop that strength of psychological safety in ourselves and our ability to protect our own psychological safety and protect our own ability to be okay in difficult circumstances when we are not okay, by our circumstances. And that kind of, when in doubt, in terms of trying to affect change on a larger level, when in doubt, start with yourself. Start with that compassion and kindness with yourself, and then you'll be bringing your best self to the overall dynamic. I also wanted to ask you just a little bit more so that anyone listening can find out information about your book. What will it include? Where will it be? How can people find it? When does it get released?
Yeah, so it'll all be obviously on my social media, Anna Zanides, and my website, which is annazanides.com. It's currently going through an edit, so I'm waiting for that to come back tomorrow, and then it will need quite a lot of rewriting, I am sure. It's going to be a little bit alternative in my views. I'm quite alternative. It's challenging the social norms, really, in workplaces, in relationships. The whole works is what I want, is people to basically question every single thing that they do in their lives, because that is where freedom comes. So yeah, just reach out to me as well if you need any help or any whatever it is. I'm always up for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much,
Thank
Anna.
you for your time. It was brilliant.
It has been an absolute joy to have you here, and for everyone listening as well. So we're going to be doing more lives like this, structured, or having guests, where it'll be either myself or Evelina who will be hosting, and some of the time it will be both of us as well. So look out for more lives like this where we have amazing guests like Anna, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.